From the very start of his ministry, Jesus had his critics. People of faith who criticized the things he did and the things he said. Now, maybe we can understand why they would criticize Jesus for teaching what sounded to them like radical and at times heretical interpretations of Scripture. But it's hard to grasp why people would have criticized Jesus under any circumstance for healing someone. Because really, who would begrudge someone such a wonderful gift as being restored to wholeness and joy? What hypocrites, we say. Yet it's important to recall that not all Pharisees rejected Jesus. Some had actually become his staunchest defenders. For those, though, who criticized his every move, they felt there was a great deal at stake. It was their responsibility to teach what the law of Moses commanded. But they bore an even greater responsibility of teaching how the law was to be applied in any given situation. The Pharisees felt it was their highest duty to protect obedience to the law from compromise and faith from secular influence. The conflict between Pharisees and Jesus was never a matter of what the law said, but a matter of to whom and how the law was to be applied in all the realities and complexities of life. In today's confrontations with the disciples and Jesus, the Pharisees had to decide if there were permitted exceptions to the prohibition of working on the Sabbath. Strict adherence to the commandment to refrain from working on the Sabbath was at the very core of what it meant to be a pious Jew and a member of the covenant community. Now, being a pastor in New Jersey typically entailed visits to major teaching hospitals in New York City or Philadelphia. So one Saturday, I drove into Mount Sinai Hospital in New York to visit a young father who had just been diagnosed with brain cancer. I got into the elevator in the lobby to go up into his room. And before I could push the button for his floor, the doors quickly shut and the elevator started moving. And then it proceeded to stop on every floor. The second time it happened, an elderly man behind me started yelling at me in some foreign language. And at first I couldn't figure out why he was so angry. And then I realized he thought that I was pushing the buttons to make the elevator stop. So I lifted my hands to show him that it wasn't true. And his son, who was standing next to the elderly man, tried to assure him, but it went to no avail. And just as I tried to keep trying to calm him down, it dawned on me that I was in a Jewish hospital. And I noticed a red sign hanging on the wall of the elevator that read, "On the Sabbath, the elevators will stop on every floor." It was then that I learned that the strict prohibition of working on the Sabbath included operating mechanical machinery, even something so inconsequential as pushing a button on an elevator. A humbling reminder to me that faithful Jews to this day strictly adhere, without exception, to the requirements of the Sabbath commandment. And when you stop and think about it, it's quite admirable in today's world where it seems that everything and anything can take precedence over keeping Sabbath as a day to stop, to rest, and to worship. On one Sabbath day, the disciples found themselves hungry. And as they did what they always did. They plucked heads of grain in a field, rubbed them in their hands, and then ate the kernels. Seeing them do that, a group of Pharisees complained that this constituted threshing, and therefore they were working on the Sabbath. Well, Jesus was quick to come to their defense. And first, he reminds the Pharisees that there was precedent for what the disciples had done. Before he became king, David and his companions also broke the law when they too were hungry. They entered the house of God and they ate the consecrated bread, the bread called the bread of presence because it symbolized the very presence of God in their midst. So only priests were allowed to eat of it. But that day, David's need took precedence over the law. The Pharisees, Jesus said, should know that there are times when it is permissible to act contrary to the law for the sake of human need. But his lesson didn't stop there. Jesus says to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Meaning if anyone had the right to reinterpret how the Sabbath command was to be applied, it was the one who issued the command in the first place. It doesn't appear to the Pharisees that they realize that Jesus has just declared to them that he and God are one, which in their eyes would mean he had just committed the sin of blasphemy. Instead, they leave the synagogue resolved to find some other way to accuse Jesus of breaking the law. And that time came when on another Sabbath day, when Jesus was teaching in the synagogue, and they waited and they watched to see if he would again break the law by healing a man with a withered hand. Healing was also considered a work. And the only exception for healing on the Sabbath was if someone was in imminent danger of dying. And then a rabbi could take steps to help that person. So Jesus wouldn't have been the first or only rabbi to heal someone on the Sabbath. But this man was in no danger of dying. So Jesus could easily have waited till the next day. But instead, he decided to ask a piercing question to expose the maliciousness of his accuser's intention. Is it legal to save life or to destroy it on the Sabbath? And while they scratched their head, Jesus answers the question for himself by healing the man's hand, showing the Pharisees it's always right to do what matters most on the Sabbath. Because keeping Sabbath isn't just about one day of rest and worship. Keeping Sabbath is about participating in God's work of renewal and restoration in our own lives and in the life of the world. It means keeping Sabbath daily by striving to live as God desires us to live, a life of rhythm and balance. Which means when our lives become disordered, we are to focus on what matters most for the sake of restoration and renewal for us and our world. It's how Jesus lived every day of his life. And I think it's an important reminder for his church. endeavoring to follow in his footsteps. Because sadly, too often, the church, in trying to do too much, becomes prone to burnout. Dedicated disciples come to feel as though they have no life but church life. And nothing breaks the heart of a pastor more. And burnout quickly leads to decline. It's one of the lessons the church has learned as we look back on the ministry in the 80s and in the 90s, when the focus was on creating heavily programmed churches. Some of those churches offered so many programs that families didn't feel like they had time to be a family. And as one church commentator puts it, ministry must complement people's lives, not compete with people's lives. And to avoid that pitfall, we need to follow Jesus and focus on doing what matters most. The church's mission has been and will always be the same: to equip people to live out their faith in the world. That's what matters most. Rather than seeking to attract people through our programming, we should strive to equip them to engage the world around them. So when we hear about church decline or the church dying, it isn't. The emerging truth is that engagement will drive growth. The church isn't going to disappear. We might not gather again in large numbers, but we will grow larger through smaller, intimate connections, whether it be in small groups, whether it be in focused mission projects, whether it be in smaller worship experiences. We will grow as we do what matters most. And what matters most will lead people to renewal and restoration in their lives, in the lives of others, and in the life of our world.